There's a version of provocation-based practice that's child-led. It's reactive to children's needs. It's rooted in the belief that this is how children learn best. But then there's also another version, one that looks great in pictures on Pinterest, on Instagram, but it has very little to do with what the children actually need.
It's easy to copy something visually, but without having that intention behind it. The learning changes completely. The provocation can get lost when it becomes about replicating an aesthetic rather than responding to the children in front of you.
So the creative process also has something to teach us about children's learning that no framework can fully capture. So when you sit with like a pile of loose parts and ask yourself, what goes together? What are you doing exactly? What do you want the children to do?
And it can feel like intentional setups are just another thing to add on to the workload. We have data, lessons, observations, resources, admin. So people think, oh, now I've got to do a setup and a provocation. Like it's a lot.
Most of us have had a moment where we looked at something we spent time setting up and wondered, who is this really for? There's a version of provocation-based practice that's child-led. It's reactive to children's needs. It's rooted in the belief that this is how children learn best. But then there's also another version, one that looks great in pictures on Pinterest, on Instagram, and anywhere else online. And it gets a lot of saves, but it has very little to do with what the children actually need. As educators, we've probably done both. And most of us have had a moment where we looked at something we spent time setting up and wondered, who is this really for? That question, who is this really for, is one of the most important things an early years educator can sit with. And that's exactly where today's conversation begins. Welcome back to the Early Years Academy podcast, brought to you by the Early Years Academy by Paranap, your village for the early years. I'm Dana Kinney, Head of Pedagogy at Paranap, early childhood educator, former center principal, and master trainer in trauma-informed practices. My guest today has built one of the most beautiful early years communities online, Tuff with Soph, and she is someone we're really excited to have on, talking about provocations beyond aesthetics and as true invitations to play and explore and make the learning their own. Sophie, big welcome to the podcast episode, Before the Children Arrive, Provocations, Creativity, and the Joy of Setup.
Thank you very much, Dana. It's so nice to be speaking with you. And I can't wait to see what discussions we're going to get into about provocations and all things early years.
So there's this question that changed the way I set up my provocations. And this happened very early in my career. I was a fresh early years educator, still learning what is a provocation, what this meant in practice, and I had set something up that I was genuinely proud of for day one. And an educator I really respected came over and said, "Can I give you my thoughts?" And I said, "Sure." She says, "This is beautiful, but what is there for the children to do?" What is there for the children to do? I think about that question almost every time I walk into a setting now, and it tells me everything. Because the moment you ask it, you stop seeing the setup or the activity or a Tuff tray or the environment as a physical entity. You start seeing the child. You ask yourself, can they get into this? Can they change it? Can they take it somewhere you didn't plan? Is there room in this setup for their ideas, not just yours? So that one question is the difference between a provocation and a display. And that's actually what we wanted to talk about today. Not the Tuff tray itself, but what is it for? And what it really is for is the children. So when you're setting up a tray, Sophie, what's the internal process like? Is there a question you're starting from, or does the questions emerge as you're working?
Well, if I'm being completely honest, it doesn't always feel like a clear step-by-step process, and I think a lot of that comes down to building my intuition over time. In the back of my mind, I'm always thinking a few things, like what are we currently working on from a curriculum perspective, what have I noticed about the children, and what are they currently interested in as well. I'm constantly thinking about how those things all together can connect, and how can I bring the learning into something that feels meaningful and engaging for them, but also keeping it open-ended and connecting to the curriculum. But most of the time, my ideas are just spontaneous, and those ones are usually my best ideas, but still done through observations. It might feel random in the moment, but it's really built on knowing the class well and being responsive to them. I think that is the important part of it, to be honest, allowing yourself that flexibility rather than feeling like everything has to be pre-planned or perfectly structured, just having that spontaneity and trusting your spontaneity as well.
I think the difference between a Tuff tray as a provocation and one that's just a display is probably the intention. So a provocation is set up with a question behind it, even if that question is never really asked out loud. So it could be questions that you ask the child or you want to ask of the child, or the child can ask of themselves when they approach it. So things like, what happens if I put these materials together? Or what will, what will they notice? What might they connect to? Those questions are what helped me distinguish between designing for learning versus setting up provocations to fill the space. So something I think about is the relationship between the tray or the setup and the planning and the documentation that follows it. We often set up such great and genuinely thought-provoking provocations, but then we feel the pressure to back map them to a framework outcome in a way that flattens what actually happened, because the learning isn't just fine motor skill development happening here, right? There's a lot that the child is processing and testing and doing. So, I think the lines are blurred, to be honest. It's so easy to set something up thinking it's for the children when it has less to do with them and maybe more to do with our timetables, our wants and needs, or our scheduling. So, Sophie, is there a common mistake you might see educators make when they move from I saw this online to I set it up in my room? And where does the provocation get lost?
Yeah, it really can. I think the most common mistake is focusing on the what instead of the why. I'm quite fortunate that my FS lead really does focus on the why. We're constantly asked to think of why, because at the end of the day, why are we doing it? Why is every educator doing this? What's the reason? Because you saw it online, but how do you know that it will work for your children? I think sometimes that is the thing about being a content creator. It's easy to copy something visually, but without having that intention behind it, the learning changes completely. The provocation can get lost when it becomes about replicating an aesthetic rather than responding to the children in front of you. To be honest, I'm not ashamed to admit I've done this. I've set up something simply because it looks good, not actually considering the intention behind it, and I'm sure we're all guilty of this. It looks good. Yeah. Okay, I want that in my classroom because I want my classroom to look good. And the context is huge. What works in one classroom won't necessarily work in another one. Every group of children is different, so therefore the provision should reflect that too. So instead of asking, how do I recreate this? I think it's much more powerful to ask, what's the thinking behind this and how does that apply to my children? How can I take that learning but apply it to what my children need to do in this moment of time?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So I actually wanted to push back on something, because the way we usually talk about educator creativity, because I don't think the way that we talk about it is necessarily the way that it works. So we talk about it like it's something that you either have or you don't, like it's a personality trait. But in my experience, creativity in early years is contagious. So I think it moves through people and it spreads. And I saw this firsthand at the center I worked for close to 10 years. We had a group on Parent App where educators would share what they were setting up. So photos, ideas, things they were trying out and maybe weren't sure how to extend or what to add on to it. We called that group Inspiration. And what started happening was that somebody would see what a colleague had done in another room, take that idea and do something completely different with it, or add something unique, like you were just mentioning, like apply it to the context of their classroom. But that inspiration, that initial spark, came from somewhere. And and you know what Parent App did in that context is just put educators inside of each other's rooms. So in a job where we enter buildings full of adults, as early as educators, we're actually quite isolated. You know, we're with children all day and rarely see what anybody else is doing. And
Yep.
the visibility that Parent App has allowed through that has changed it. And I think the visibility that also Instagram and things like Pinterest have done recently have changed that. And I think the real conversation isn't necessarily about educator creativity and not whether or not they have it, but whether or not they're around people who make it feel possible, or whether they have access to systems that, again, make inspiration possible. So coming back to like the way creativity is fostered and the way creativity is, you know, moves through people, I wanted to ask, where does your creative thinking happen? Like, what conditions do you need to bring to life, you know, the setups that you make possible for your children?
Wow, so this is going to surprise a lot of people, I feel, but I'd say my creativity comes alive in the opposite way that people might expect. I feel like I thrive in a busy, active classroom. When the children are fully engaged and there's just that buzz of learning, that's honestly where my brain works best. I think being surrounded by the energy actually helps me think more clearly and more creatively, weirdly enough. I know that a lot of people do need a quiet environment to think, process, but for me, I find quiet environments quite difficult. I kind of go a bit flat creatively. I need that movement, noise, real life context happening around me. And that's probably why working in early years suits me so well, is that some people can get overwhelmed by that noise, overstimulated, but I feel like I thrive in that environment. And my creativity really just comes alive, and one idea will spark another idea. So I'm quite fortunate in that way.
I love how you mentioned the fact that you get your inspiration or your creativity from the classroom, because I think there's a specific kind of like joy that comes from making something, setting it up, and then watching it be used by children. That experience, I always believed, is like deeply connected to educator retention and well-being, because educators who feel creative in their work then feel ownership over their work, and ownership is one of the strongest predictors of whether or not someone stays in the sector. So the creative process also has something to teach us about children's learning that no framework can fully capture. So when you sit with like a pile of loose parts and ask yourself, what goes together? What are you doing exactly? What do you want the children to do? You're noticing, decision making. You're noticing holding an idea and testing it. And educators who set up provocations with genuine curiosity bring that curiosity into the room, and then children feel it. So you're not setting it up from a place of, I know this is what's best, or I know exactly what you're going to do with it, but you're setting it up from a place that kind of works alongside the children, where you're saying to them, like, I'm not really sure what you are going to do with this, but I'm so excited to find out. So Sophie, you've built a community that people come to for inspiration, but how do you think about the risks of what you share becoming a template rather than a spark?
I do think about that a lot, because it is a real risk at the end of the day. I have fortunately built up a big community, and people do come to me for ideas and inspiration. And when you share something visually, it's very easy for that to be taken as, is this what it should look like? Rather than, this is one way that it could look like. And that's never my intention when sharing the content. What I try to do is keep bringing it back to the thinking behind it. I always like to advocate for being child-led, and I consistently say this, and I'm always following my children's interests. I also think it's important to say quite openly that it shouldn't be copied. Different children, different classrooms, different moments. It's not meant to be replicated, it is meant to be adapted. And that's what I do with other people's content. I see something I like, and I think, oh, okay, I love this. How will that work in my classroom? Knowing what I know about my children. So for me, if someone looks at what I've shared, I hope it makes them think a little bit differently or notice something new about their own classroom. And if it does, then I've done my job well. I'm not trying to give people something to copy. I'm hoping to give them something to think about.
And what I love is that you always take a picture of like your provocation before the children come in and utilize it, but then you also show us a glimpse of what the children do with the provocation, like as they're playing with it, and then what it looks like at the end. So then the focus, I think when you do that, you do something so important because the focus no longer becomes the actual setup. It becomes like the process and the way that you celebrate what the children have done with the different things. And even if they don't utilize, you know, the macaronis in your Tuff tray for whatever purpose you want them to, the fact that they took it and took it elsewhere into the kitchen corner and they started cooking with it and you celebrate that, I think helps us see that, again, provocations aren't necessarily just what's in the Tuff tray. It's like a whole process that you go through with the children. So I love that you take us on that journey. But I want to know, what does your own creative process look like? Because I see like it's provocation after provocation, and I know that creativity doesn't run out. We believe that the more you use, the more you get. But do you have a certain, do you go to a certain place for inspiration?
I think when I'm not thinking about sharing content, it's actually more instinctive and probably quite unpolished. Usually starts with the children, what I've noticed in the classroom, what do they keep coming back to, or even just small snippets of conversation that I'm overhearing. That tends to sit with me, and I'll start thinking, okay, what could I offer next? That keeps that curiosity going. It's about sitting in provision with them and hearing those conversations and allowing yourself to, like, if you're sat down listening, that is okay. That is you taking those observations. And it's sitting with them, hearing those conversations, knowing what every single child is interested in that week. So an example of this is when I put some blocks and planes and ramps into a Tuff tray, because one boy had come in from the weekend and he was so invested in planes. He really was going for the planes that week. He actually enjoyed building an airport, moving the ramps around, making them balance, how to make them steeper so that the planes would go down faster, and just experimenting really. But then other children came in and adapted on that learning and furthered that. So those moments just make you think, this is how it needs to be, and this is what I love.
Right. And this is how it needs to be. And I think you can only get there if you resist the urge to redirect, right? And if you can stand back and let the macaroni leave your Tuff tray and go to the kitchen, or like let your pebbles leave, you know, the pneumacons and go to the Play-Doh table. And if you have that level of restraint, that specific active restraint of not saying, actually, let's leave that here, or no, that's not meant to go to the kitchen, come back. And it's actually a lot harder than it sounds, right? Because everything in us wants to guide. That's why we got into this work, you know, and we want to make sure that we're holding boundaries for the children. We want to make sure that we have classroom rules and they're always respected, and that there's some sort of order. But I also think sometimes the most important pedagogical decision we can make all day is to say nothing and just do what you said, which is like sit back, observe, watch what they're doing with it, take notes because that's then going to help you set up your next provocation. So I love how your creative process actually begins and ends with you, like inside, reflecting on what the children did, internalizing that and then thinking, okay, where can I go next from here? But speaking of, working really hard to set up a Tuff tray and then watching a child do something completely different with it, um, do you have another example that you can share with us where, something like that has happened, and what has that really taught you?
Yeah, kind of the way that Tuff trays can get hijacked and they go down a route that it wasn't supposed to. Things like that do happen all the time. And as a educator, it's about noticing that and then, okay, let's see. One example that actually stands out was a dinosaur tray that I had. I'd set it up so beautifully. It was meant to be small world storytelling, sand, cardboard boxes, dinosaur figures. I'd really thought this out. We're interested in dinosaurs. Okay, I've got everything together. Here we go. But they weren't really particularly interested in how I'd set it up. They wanted to take it their way, and they took it in a different direction. They were taking the loose parts, adding the loose parts in. They took, do you know, like curtain rings? They started placing those on the dinosaurs, counting, comparing how many rings can each dinosaur hold. Some can hold more than others. They noticed that a brachiosaurus could hold the most because it has the longest neck. They brought in cars, which then led to a really interesting conversation about whether cars existed when dinosaurs were around. It just opened up so much communication and language that I hadn't actually planned for at all. So although my intention was small world storytelling and that kind of just fell flat, it turned out to be so much better. And that taught me that when you genuinely leave space for children to interpret the resources themselves, you more often than not get deeper learning than anything you could have planned for. And I feel like I'm being very honest, but I'm not afraid to admit, a few years ago I'd have said, oh, that doesn't go in there, that stays over there, you can't take that over there. I feel like we've been through that kind of era. And now I sit and wonder how many learning opportunities I've missed over my career because I've been in that way. But you do learn and you become a better teacher every year for it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, Sophie, very early on, I definitely was that teacher. Like, nope, that rolling pin is for the Play-Doh. It stays on the Play-Doh table. And like, no, the beans are for the maths corner. We got to leave them in the maths corner. And you're absolutely right. When you think about it, you realize how many learning opportunities you actually prevented. Meanwhile, I was celebrating the fact that there are pebbles in the math corner. But what's the use if they're not being used, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's when I realized the invitation to learn actually only works if the educator is willing to let the children decline it. So that sounds like it doesn't make sense, but honestly, if in order for us to trust that the children are going to learn or get out of an experience what they need to or what's best for them, we have to be comfortable with them declining our way or declining our setups or declining our expectations, and then to sit back and be able to watch them do something else with it.
And it's not about rejection. It's that they are taking this in a better way, in which a way that they want to.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's separating ourselves from our setup. So the thing is with creativity is a lot of times, right, like with artists, when they draw a picture, they are pouring like a part of themselves into that. So very similarly, like when educators use the creative process of setting up a provocation, you're also kind of pouring like a bit of yourself into
That's
that
how it
setup.
feels.
Yes. So when a child looks at it, decides to do something different, it's really hard not to see that as like rejection a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I get why. I definitely get why it's hard. But then I also think that every time you give in to that temptation, um, you are you are blocking curiosity. You're blocking, that there's an innate um, gut feeling that children have, which
Yeah.
they know what they need to learn. But then if we're constantly redirecting them, we're subconsciously telling them you don't know what you need, like an adult knows. And that's not the message we want to send to the children that are in our classrooms. I know that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but there's also something worth naming about the child who engages in a way that looks like destruction, if I can say. So, like, who tips everything out, or like who mixes all the colors, or who spreads the contents of your Tuff tray across the floor. Um, and I think it took me a really long time to see that that child's not misusing the provocation. They're engaging with it, actually the most deeply, because um, there's this desire that they have inside of them that they don't even have the skill set for to inhibit. Um, and a lot of times they are testing the cause and effect relationship, and it's not necessarily in a productive way, but just observing them do that gives you insight into what it is you can then set up for them, so that your provocations for them could be more productive without it taking away from the opportunities of the other children in the class. So I wanted to ask you, is there a type of child for whom tough tray play is essentially significant for, in your experience? Is there someone who you've seen access something through a provocation that they couldn't access another way?
Um, yeah, I think there are children who don't naturally access certain areas of the classroom, or they can feel a bit unsure about entering more defined provision areas, because there have definitely been times where children might not choose a particular area of the classroom, but when I bring elements of their preferred areas into a Tuff tray, it suddenly becomes a lot more accessible to them. I think Tuff trays in a classroom are usually positioned quite well. It's central, it's contained, and it feels less overwhelming than going into a defined area, because I feel like defined areas have that expectation attached to it.
Yeah.
It gives the children more of a softer entry point when there is a Tuff tray, and it can draw children into experiences that they might otherwise avoid. It kind of gives them that confidence to explore it in a more open, low pressure way, rather than saying, okay, let's go over here. I've put the dinosaurs in the mark making area, but they don't like the mark making area, so it's not going to make them draw. Having it in a more open area that's less pressure, they would be more inclined to go there. I feel like it really benefits those kind of children that like to keep themselves in one area and don't like to venture out, because we all have those children.
Yeah. Definitely. I wanted to actually backtrack a little bit and talk about what it takes to set up a provocation, because it's not throwing things together in a tough tray and hoping things go together or things work or it sparks the children's interest. It's a genuine um, provocation that requires a lot of thought. It requires you to know, as you said, Sophie, the children in front of you, to have a question behind what you're putting out, and to make like deliberate choices about the materials or the space or the invitation. And all of that takes time, and it takes a kind of mental quiet that's really hard to find. I remember mornings where I would walk into my classroom or on the way to my classroom, still reading like WhatsApp groups and my WhatsApp group for work, and finding out that someone had called in sick and our non-contact time was canceled. I'd then like actually get in through the door of my classroom and find a sticky note on my desk. And it would be a parent who had missed parent teacher meeting last week and wanted to come and see me today. And then I'd be like, okay, so I'm holding my phone with the WhatsApp messages, I'm holding the sticky note, I'd open up my email, and I'd see an email from my curriculum lead, and she would want observations and reports, to be done before I left that day. And I remember holding all of that and thinking I still had to set up the room before the children arrived. And I think that's the reality of our work. What I described is not occasional. So if I think it's actually kind of regular. And I think if we're going to have an honest conversation about sustaining joy in early years and like protecting our creativity, and protecting our practices, then we have to also talk about the conditions which might undermine our joy and our creativity process. So with the gap between what the job asks you of and what it actually gives you back, I wanted to ask you, what do you say to an educator who says that they would love to set up more intentional provocation, but just doesn't have the time or feels like the system isn't helping them?
First thing I'd say, I completely understand. I think everybody in education feels the same. It's kind of like the elephant in the room of we all know it's happening, but we kind of they have that expectation to, okay, let's just get on with it. And we do, but obviously inside, we're still thinking, okay, we still have this to-do list, all these things to do. And as we all know, time is one of the biggest pressures in early years and teaching, and it can feel like intentional setups are just another thing to add on to the workload. We have data, lessons, observations, resources, admin. So people think, oh, now I've got to do a setup and a provocation. Like it's a lot. In my opinion, I would try and reframe it, not as something extra, but as something that can be done as part of what you're already doing. It doesn't always have to be elaborate. Some of the most meaningful provocations that I've set up have taken minutes, genuinely minutes, just because it's come from my observations. Another thing I'd stress, don't change your enhancements or provocations on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. This causes burnout and constantly having to think of new things, setting them up. I only change mine when the children get bored and they stop engaging with it, because some provocations have genuinely been set up for 3 to 4 weeks because they keep adapting, learning and changing it themselves. So if they're choosing to change it, why do I have to? I just roll with it and see what they're doing.
Exactly. And then that's how they learn how to extend on their ideas as well. If every day they walk into the classroom and it's a different provocation, they can't really revisit the ideas that they tried or tested the day before. You can't really build that sustained concentration on a certain topic as well. So I love that. The only thing I would add to that, and that was really beautiful, is also to try and find the joy in the setup. So when I discovered like the setup ritual and the fact that setting up, like that physical act of setting up my classroom wasn't just for the children, it was actually for me, things changed. So there is neurological evidence that when you use your creativity, even like a brief creative engagement, it actually shifts your psychological state. So educators who have like a ritual of creative preparation, so before the day begins, if they're like, walking around their classroom or thinking, what could I add here? What could I move there? They actually report feeling more present once the children arrive. And I think that's just because they come in and they look at things differently. And they embody like the child's curiosity as well when they're walking through. So creativity can be a form of professional resilience, I think I would say, in its very literal sense. So having something in the work that's genuinely yours, that expresses something of like how you think and what you find beautiful and what you believe about the children, it gives you a reason to keep going, and that's more durable than like a pay raise or a performance review. I think when you find that innate spark where you find genuine joy in setting up. But still, I think I need to mention that conditions matter. So educators should not have to steal time to be creative. And, our sector's relationship with planning time, preparation time, and non-contact time is something that we need to keep talking about. As you said, we find ourselves having access to less and less of it.
Yeah.
But that's something I say not as a complaint, but as something for us to maybe actively um, collaborate and brainstorm on what to do. But Sophie, has there been a
Yeah.
period in your own practice where you felt like you lost the joy, and what brought it back for you?
Absolutely. I think we all go through this as educators. I feel like we get to a point where we're kind of keeping on track, but we're slowly losing that joy. For me, I think I got to that point in my career where I realised how I wanted to teach, and that the school that I was at was not an advocate for that. I wanted to be in provision more child-led, following interests, and not really following themes. Um, in no way am I saying what they did was wrong, it just didn't align with what I wanted for myself or my class, so I knew that's where I needed to change. So it's about thinking how you want your teaching to become and finding somewhere that aligns with that and supports that growth, because now I'm in a school where it has those things, and the joy has come back, and like you were saying, I go into my classroom and I genuinely get joy out of having it set up not for the children but also for me. Like, I take a lot of pride in my classroom. Everyone that knows me on Instagram, I take a lot of pride in it, and it's my home away from home. I want it to be cozy for me. I really do get joy out of the current classroom I have. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I can see that, and I could see how when you walk in, you have this ritual of like just revisiting the areas and seeing like, okay, what's fallen apart? What could I, put in? What can I replace this with? And yeah, and it reflects and it shows. And I think when you do take that pride, the children feel it as well when they walk into that space.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
If an educator has like 10 minutes and almost no materials, what does a genuine, thoughtful provocation look like?
I feel like this is the question. This is one that a lot of people will benefit from. Um, loose parts. Loose parts, 100%. They are the easiest thing to set up with little time and little materials. And I'm such a huge advocate for loose parts. It doesn't need to be expensive or planned in advance. I'm always scrounging around for materials. My husband, I drive him insane. He can't throw anything in the bin. Coffee pods, I keep them. Rinse the coffee out, they're great loose parts. They go in the construction area. Egg boxes, bottles, packaging, natural objects, shells, coral, everything.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking, how can this be used in the classroom? But the key isn't just the materials, it's the intention behind them. Um, a thoughtful provocation might just be a selection of loose parts, but it's got to be placed with a purpose based on what you've noticed about the children. An example of this was we actually read the story Sharing a Shell, if you've heard of that, and they were noticing all the sea life in the book, and one of them actually noticed the coral. So we started discussing about coral, and I told the class that I have some at home, and they were like, can you bring it in? Can you bring it in? I was like, okay, yeah. So brought it into school, and they were feeling it and smelling it, and they were so engaged. So I thought, okay, let me add it to the Play-Doh area. Completely changed the play. They started making imprints, talking about texture, patterns, and all I did was put it in the Play-Doh area. So even just 10 minutes, it's not about the quantity of resources, it's about choosing something small but meaningful that invites that curiosity and thinking.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually wanted to go back to something that you said because I think we missed, touching upon something really, really important when you mentioned alignment. So I think provocations, when they're embedded in a setting's cultural, rather than existing as the practice of one creative individual, they do something very specific to that team. So you mentioned when you didn't find alignment with the team and switching that and how that sparked your joy again. I believe that there's something happens to a team when provocations aren't just one person's thing, but they become everybody's thing, and it becomes, the shared expectation, the shared learning that happens. And this happens when somebody usually shares a setup, somebody else takes it, they change a certain material, they try that out with their group, then they report back and they share, what the learning was, and somebody else then takes that version and tweaks it again. And then suddenly you have 3 educators who are now in conversation with each other about children and curiosity and what learning actually looks like. And this doesn't happen in a meeting. It's not in a form that you fill out. It's just the natural rhythm of the day. And you just feel so aligned with the other educators. Like, okay, this is the shared expectation, and it aligns with what you believe as well. So I think you were talking about. I've seen this. And what it did more than anything else was bring that group together. And it gave us like a shared way of looking at children as well, and a shared reason to walk into work that morning, because we felt like we were a part of something bigger, like our beliefs and our values were aligned. So the Tuff tray is a very concrete object, right? Like when we say Tuff tray, you think of the black thing that things sit inside of. But when it becomes a part of how the team thinks and shares and builds on each other's idea, it's actually becomes like a symbol for belonging. And again, like I mentioned earlier, in a profession where isolation is one of the things that drive people out, that's not a small thing to understand how the Tuff tray can bring us all together. So when you imagine the ideal early years setting, what does the relationship between the team and the environment look like? What are they all doing together?
I think the environment becomes something that the whole team actively work together with. It's not something that one person can design and that everyone else then delivers. It's got to be collaborative and responsive. The team are constantly observing together, discussing what they're noticing, especially if you have shared areas like my school do. It's not just a case of I'm only watching my class. It's we are all here for each other. It's a team effort. What are you noticing? What have your children been engaging with? Oh, mine have too. And then using that shared understanding to shape what the environment offers next. Also, I think it's important that a team is curious together, where the environment is co-constructed through shared observation rather than individual interpretation. And for me, leadership plays a really important role within that culture. When leaders are asking the reflective questions like, oh, what did you notice when you introduced this? Or what did the children do with this? It opens up that deeper professional dialogue and thinking. And I certainly reflect a lot more on my practice when my FS lead comes to me and says, oh, you used that. How did that go down today? And asks those questions about my classroom.
Yeah, I think leaders play a significant role in whether the creative practice gets nurtured or discouraged. So a leader,
Absolutely.
like you mentioned, who creates these opportunities and celebrates, the collaboration, or is building a completely different culture from a leader that just checks in with everybody just to make sure that things are happening inside their classroom. So shared provocation planning, where teams design together rather than one person is setting up while the rest manage the room. Again, it does something to professional relationships that training can't replicate. It links educators. It makes their thinking visible to each other. It inspires you again to see and to talk about what others are doing. Yeah. It's also a trust building conversation, right? Like there's a lot of trust that happens in those conversations about what worked and what didn't work for you. And then there's also
Yeah.
this deep sense of belonging as well. Like when your ideas are heard and then somebody else gives you input on your provocation. So the visible
Yes.
environment, yeah, I think the visible environment communicates the pedagogy of a setting to families in a way that philosophy can't. A parent who walks into a room and sees a provocation that clearly came from someone thinking carefully about their child's understanding, without them having to tell the educator, that builds a kind of trust and change that replicates or that ripples, I guess. What would you want a director or principal to take away from this conversation specifically? Maybe not an educator, but a leader.
Oh, okay. I think I would want directors and principals to reflect on the conditions that they create for teachers. Um, because so much of our work is provision based practice, child led learning, responsive environments. That doesn't fail at the level of the educator. That's what we're trying to do. It succeeds or struggles based on the time, the trust, and the space that we're given for thinking. So, a really simple example of this is observation. I know we keep coming back, but that is the key of FS. Um, if something, just to make people think who are listening to this, if you're sat in your classroom, just sat back watching the children, what would your leadership think that you're doing? Would it be seen as you're not doing anything, or would it be understood as professional observation? I'm going off, you're not sat there with a coffee on your phone, of course, but if you are sat there just keeping back and just watching. Because in my setting, I'm so fortunate that SLT will often say, if we see you sitting back, we know you're observing. And that level of trust makes such a difference, because observation is a key part of understanding the children and how they engage when the adult isn't intervening. And I think that's the whole point. How can we expect educators to truly know the children if they're not given the time and the permission to step back and watch them? When the conditions are in place, everything else becomes intentional, responsive, and ultimately more meaningful for the children. So it's all about leaders, principals giving trust to their staff.
Yeah, definitely. I think something that has stayed with me throughout this conversation is that, or is the idea that we set out, or what we set out is always a statement of belief about what children are capable of. So, what they deserve to encounter, or what kind of adults we want to be in their presence. And I love how you mentioned that the fact that if you're sat back and you're observing, your leaders know that you're doing just that. And I think that when you give yourself permission to observe and be present, that's when children learn to observe their surroundings and be present as well. And in a sector that often asks us to, manage rather than create, um, the educator who still sets up something beautiful, open, and genuinely thought provoking before the children arrive is actually doing something very important. Sophie, I wanted to say thank you so much for the conversation and for the community you've built and for making this part of the work visible. Um, Tell our listeners where they can find you and what it is that you do on your page.
So I am at Tough Trays with Soph on Instagram, and I love to share ideas, provision, lessons, and I'm a huge advocate of child-led learning, following interests, and if that's your vibe, give me a follow. And also,
Definitely.
I like to take inspiration from others, so anyone else, honestly, give me a follow and reach out.
I know I've taken so much inspiration from you as well along the years. I've always been, again, and I love that you don't just take a picture of your Tuff tray at the beginning of a setup, but you show us what the children did after. And in a Pinterest world where all we get to see is that perfect Tuff tray setting, it's so refreshing to see something that's so raw and authentic and, again, purposeful and child-led too. If today's episode resonated, if today's episode resonated, share it with a colleague, a director, or someone who needs a reminder of why they got into this work and what it still has to offer them. Sophie, a genuine big thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to talk to you.
I'm Dana Elkinney, and this is the Early Years Academy podcast, your village for the early years. We're here because everyone at Paranat believes deeply that the adults in a child's life, so the educators, the leaders, the families, they deserve the same care, love, and attention that you pour into the children you serve daily. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you at the next episode.